Harry Leland Mitchell comes up on the stage and he says, "This man's staying at my house, and if any of these cowards covered up in pillowcases want to come by, they can come and see my shotgun in their face." So these guys were the real deal.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
Why don't we talk about something that I've been working on? Have I talked to you all about the Southern Tenant Farmers Union before? I've been sort of working on this piece for a while, so I might have brought it up, but I don't mind telling the story again because I think it's a very good time to tell it. If you aren't familiar, it's a really cool labor story. I've been working on it for a while. A review of a really excellent autobiography of H.L. Mitchell, Harry Leland Mitchell, who was a great labor organizer, Southerner, born in Western Tennessee, but did most of his work in Arkansas, founding the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. And when a lot of people hear about sharecroppers and tenant farmers unions, they think about where y'all are from, Alabama. And not to steal y'all's shine, these things are arm in arm. But the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, I think, is a story that a lot of people should be more familiar with because it's truly exceptional. And the Southern Tenant Farmers Union was a very radical and fascinating union that was able to organize a lot of people across the South and the country at a time when it was really, really difficult to do so. Now, I think most of y'all's listeners are familiar with the tenant farming or sharecropping system, but it's a vestige of the plantation economy. And across most of the South in the 20th century, particularly in the rural South, I mean, that was the only game in town, particularly in the Western South, Arkansas, Louisiana, Bama, Tennessee, and Texas, and Oklahoma. And the Southern Tenant Farmers Union was founded by a bunch of radicals in eastern Arkansas who were socialists, were members of the Socialist Party, and were encouraged by some of the great leaders of the Socialist Party. It's like, oh, it's all, fine and well that, you guys are organizing locals down here. But what would be really helpful is if we could find a way to start fighting directly for people's everyday needs. And the Southern Tenant Farmers Union was sort of founded with this goal in mind, and notably was one of the first interracial unions in the South, if not the first, certainly one of the largest ever in the early 20th century. And it all comes to a head during the Great Depression, when FDR and the Democrats started to push forward the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which, without getting too far into the weeds here, was basically a way to try to revive the agricultural economy during the Great Depression. And the idea was we need to increase the price of goods in on the market. So we want most plantations and most farms to leave 1/3 of their crop to tear it up. And the problem is in the South versus the Midwest, where this program was much more popular and effective. The problem in the South is most of the farmland was owned by one or small owners who had sharecroppers or tenant farmers working the land. The government was supposed to pay you for not farming on it. But the problem is I'm sure it comes as no surprise to y'all or nobody else listening to this, these plantation bosses weren't particularly interested in paying out money to these tenant farmers and sharecroppers. So the Tenant Farmers Union, yes, sir. So the Tenant Farmers Union organized around getting people jobs who had been sort of cast out of their homes with some of these federal programs, but also on pushing the FDR administration to take seriously the plight of Southern tenant farmers. And I mean, man, let's start with the gallantry before we get to some of the kind of nuts and bolts. How about that? Because I've been doing this, I've been reading and sort of living through the story for too long. I sometimes focus too much on the nuts and bolts and not the exciting thing. This was an interracial union in the South. And I'll tell y'all, there were some people in power who did not like blacks and whites working together in for their own common interest and common good, particularly an offshoot of the KKK, the Night Riders. and the Southern tenant farmers were, trying to organize, but there was a lot of hesitation from folks, particularly, Black folks, about whether or not, these promises were real. And two, when these night riders and also the plantation bosses would have the defense of the other members of the union. And very early on in the in the story of the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, a bunch of one of these meetings is attacked, and 3 union organizers were captured by the night riders and one of the county sheriffs, and they were held in prison. They were beaten brutally, of course, beforehand. And the Southern Tenant Farmers Union got all of their members, who of course were armed, to go and surround the prison, and to show up in the courthouse and demand that these people get let go. And after that moment, when these 3 union organizers, 2 of them white and one of them black, a black radical preacher, were let go, the membership of the Southern Tenant Farmers Union exploded, because the movement had gone behind from like nice words and visions of the future to actual like practical solidarity, and it expanded like wildfire.
Hey, 5 seconds. Just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate.
And there were all of these stories of the night riders coming and attacking meetings. Harry Leland Mitchell has this pretty impressive story of him speaking in a town square, and he's giving a speech, and he hears somebody shooting off firecrackers behind him, and he's like, "Oh, I'm not going to, get spooked by any of these." Any of these tactics from these hooligans and night riders and freaks out there. Well, it turns out it was a gun, and thankfully the night rider was a pretty bad shot, but it's a pretty gallant image of Harry Leland Mitchell being shot at a bunch of times by one of these racists and being unfazed and continuing through his speech. But it got really, really radical very quickly. I opened the story in the Jackman piece, which will hopefully come out in the next couple of weeks, with this story of a young radical Methodist preacher giving a speech to a bunch of tenant farmers, where he says, "I can organize in just 1 second, I can organize a lynch mob to come out there and lynch all of these planters and son of a bees." I don't know if we're a lot of curse here, and the crowd erupts in applause, and Harry Leland Mitchell comes up on the stage and he says, "This man's staying at my house, and if any of these cowards covered up in pillowcases want to come by, they can come and see me, and they'll see my shotgun and in their face." So these guys were like the real deal. They were taking on not just the government, not just the bosses, but a racist police state, literal racists in the KKK and the Night Riders. And they were able to get tremendous gains. They were able to get minimum payments, which were quite high, for picking cotton. They organized leaflet campaigns. They expanded significantly their membership across the South. There's a lot of really fascinating stories about the relationship with Commonwealth College. I don't know if y'all are familiar with that bit of history, but that was a radical socialist college in Arkansas as well at the time. So there's a lot of things about how this Southern Tenant Farmers Union was sort of interacting with the socialist movement. I don't want to spoil all the good bits of the piece, but what's also really interesting is the way that they had to take on the FDR administration. Because the FDR administration didn't want to get any kind of negative press about, their policies and platforms not working for working people, right? Because that's the whole point of their kind of public support. And it's an interesting kind of story, because I know a lot of people on our side can get a little misty-eyed about FDR and in that moment, and I think a lot of that for good reason, right? That was a government at a time that was doing things for people, which seems like a pretty radical cry from now. But I think it's really important when you think about some of the achievements of the FDR administration to remember that a lot of those achievements came because working people were getting organized and demanding things. Because FDR ends up acquiescing and helping out a lot of these farmers. these tenant farmers. But the early meetings were brutal. I mean, they had an official in the one of the agricultural czars in the FDR administration saying about the Southern tenant farmers when somebody was asking, hey, why are and by the way, we're talking about Henry Wallace, who's got a lot of praise from people recently, very much the villain in this story. But one of his lackeys said about the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, one of the other members of one of the other agricultural czars was saying, hey, why, when all of the other interests of American agriculture are represented here on this board, why are there no Southern Tenant Farmers Union representation? And one of them looked at him and he says, well, you wouldn't say that we would put a chicken on the poultry board. And it was like that kind of stuff, that kind of attitude, that kind of looking down that was coming from the FDR administration. And the Southern Tenant Farmers Union knew very well how to play politics. Harry Leland Mitchell, the founder of the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, said one of his great skills was in uniting people in the South and guilting rich Yankees to donating money. And they knew how to play media very well. They released a lot of really great reports. And that particular instance, because they had it on good authority, the quote that was coming out of the FDR administration, they were able to basically threaten the FDR administration that, hey, we're going to make all this stuff public that's being said about the Southern tenant farmers, because there's more and more public awareness of what was going on in the South for workers at that time. They were able to sort of force the FDR administration to come to play. And I think, remembering those stories is important for a lot of reasons, but particularly in relation to politics. That instead of thinking about politics as like, a bunch of people with good hearts got together and did good things, remember that most of those good things basically came out of cold, hard political calculations. And to make those cold, hard political calculations, you sometimes have to have a threat. And the STFU provided a very, very strong movement to do that. And yeah, I mean, sorry if I've been rambling. There's a lot in there. It's a really fascinating story, and it's a shame it's not as well known. Frankly, I didn't know too much about it before I started researching for this report.
Yeah, well, like you said at the beginning, when a lot of people, if people know about the STFU, which, as somebody mentioned in the chat, has the best union acronym of any that has ever existed. Yeah,
I don't know if there's union-made STFU merch out there, but somebody's missing an opportunity if not.
Yeah, absolutely. But, if people know about the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, they think about Alabama. They might think about Hammer and Hoe, and that's basically where I know it from, and the history that I know of the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, and so I am anxiously awaiting your Jacobin article. We will not ask you to divulge any more of the secrets or spoiler warnings, so we will rather encourage people to read it when it comes out.
Yes,
David
sir.
Griscom in Jacobin here in a few weeks talking about the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. So we'll really be looking forward to that. You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.